Inter and intra tenant communications and contract interfaces. Okay, everyone. So as we start going more in detail with contracts, I think it's time for us to understand how we allow communication between different tenants. And this is with a contract. So we use a contract same way as we apply the contract on the same tenant between two different endpoint groups. We can do that between different tenants. The only difference is that you either create a contract and export that onto the tenant that you intend to attach to, or you can create the common tenant contract and use it on all your tenants. Okay, so we have, again, contract and the common tenant contract. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? Well, the common tenant, and we mentioned on a previous video, the common tenant can share objects across the whole fabric. If you make a contract, bind it to a particular tenant. So let's say, for example, we got our tenant that we are already working with, the web SRV farm. We decide to build a contract in this tenant. The only way that I can use that to provide my access to a different tenant, it's by exporting it. Okay? And who is going to export? The provider, the tenant that is going to function as the provider, will export the contract to the consumer tenant. Okay? So again, if we want to export a contract, we export from the provider tenant to the consumer tenant. Okay? So let's take this scenario. I just draw two tenants right here. Tenant called operations farm. The other tenant is the one that we were already working with. This one we were already working with web SRV farm. Now we have an operations farm tenant. This is a separate tenant in the same ACI fabric in which we have two endpoint groups. One is called DNS, the other one is called file servers. And we need to make sure that both my endpoint groups in the web app one application profile can resolve DNS names. So my endpoint groups in the web SRV farm are going to be my consumers of those DNS services or DNS server. My tenant operations farm, the endpoint group DNS, will be my provider. So that already tells you how are you going to configure this contract. You have to create a contract and the tenant that is going to provide the service. Remember, provide the service. So configure the tenant contract, then export to consumer. Once we create that contract and our provider tenant, in this case will be operations farm, we export the contract to the consumer tenant, which is going to be web SRV farm. Once we get the contract imported into this consumer tenant, we then attach the contract to the endpoint group as a consume contract interface. This will allow communication between the endpoint group DNS and tenant operations farm to the endpoint group app SRVS and tenant web SRV farm. This is how you basically allow communication between two different tenants. That is one way of doing it. The other way, let me go ahead and clean the whiteboard, and I'm going to show you the other way, which is using the common tenant for the contract. Okay, so if we, instead of creating the contract in the provider tenant and exporting it to the consumer tenant, we can also go to the common tenant, create the contract, and we can say allow DNS, then attach the contract to the endpoint group DNS as provider, and attach the contract to the app SRVS as consumer. That's it. Because the common tenant can share. We can share resources or objects from the common tenant onto different tenants in my ACI fabric. Okay, so I can also do that. My preferred path, or I would say my preference in this type of scenario. I would rather create a contract interface because that gives me more control of what objects are attached to what, rather than relying on the common tenant to allow seamless communication or ease of config. If you keep using the common tenant as your contract source, something happens, you delete the contract, it turns out that it deletes all the references across your fabric for that particular object. So if you do that, the impact is even, is bigger because you just wiped out the object across the whole fabric on all the tenants that you were using. Obviously, you can just roll back on the config and then it's all good. But still, you don't want to go through that hassle of dropping a large environment as an ACI fabric with, hundreds of tenants. You don't want to go that route. So I would rather recommend to be more granular and add the contract interface, export the contract, do it in a way that is more control. And if something happens to that particular tenant, you're not affecting everything, right? So that's my personal. There's ways also, there's reasons why you want to do common. There's certain communication that you need to configure a common tenant object to make it happen. But in this case, for most of the time, you just export the contract, import it as a contract interface, and you're done, okay? So let's jump on the Apex GUI. We're going to create this tenant on the fly. I assume you already know how to create a tenant based on our previous videos. I'm going to go flyby. We're going to make this tenant. We're going to make the application profile called Active Directory. We'll make the endpoint group DNS, add the bridge domain, create the VRF, attach the VRF to both endpoint groups, and create this endpoint group. And then once we're ready and we have two tenants, let's build that contract. Let's export the contract and attach it to the interface, and you'll see how everything starts communicating. Okay, so I am logged into the Apex. Let me go ahead and configure that tenant very, very quick. Add tenant, operations, farm, VRF, operations, VRF. Okay, now we're gonna build that application profile. When we mentioned that it was Active Directory, let's build those endpoint groups. First one, DNS. Let's create that bridge domain for DNS. Okay, VRF. Okay, now we select the VRF. Operations VRF. Next, we assign the address to the DNS servers. In this case, will be 10.160.0.254 is my default gateway /24. And then, very important, when you are allowing communication between different tenants, you're going to be using a different VRF for each one. You want to make sure that it's shared between VRFs. Okay, so it's shared between VRFs. Make sure that you click this because again, we are sharing between different VRF. One VRF is on the web SRV farm, and the other VRF is going to be on this operations farm. So you got to make sure that we have both of them, shared between them. Okay, we'll press OK. And yes, this looks good. Next, finish. So we got the first one, and then we will work on this later. So we'll update, submit. Let's go ahead and do that other EPG, and this one is going to be called file servers. Okay, and let me also build a bridge domain. We attach that to the VRF operations VRF. Then we'll add the gateway, which is going to be 10.180.254/24. And we also want to share, because again, we also want to have communication between the file servers and the other tenant. Press OK. Next, finish. And we are done with both endpoint groups. Perfect. Now, very important. As I mentioned, we said that we want to offer DNS services to my web SRV farm. I have a different tenant holding my DNS services, or in this case, my DNS servers. So we want to allow users from the web SRV farm, or in this case, servers from the web SRV farm to hit the DNS servers. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to build a contract. The contract is going to be a standard contract, and we are going to allow DNS. The scope of the contract, global. We want to make it global because we're going to be using this between two different tenants. So make sure that you select global. Subjects, DNS allowed services. We can label this anything we want. Filter chain, and then we can either select an existing filter from the common tenant. So you see here what I mentioned, the common tenant, the objects are usable across the whole fabric, okay? But in this case, let's just be more control. And since I'm not going to test DNS. I'm just going to do an ICMP. So that tells us that we are able to reach between the two tenants. I'm just going to label this as ICMP. And then we're going to allow that service in. Okay. Ether type IP protocol, ICMP, update, and submit. Okay. Let's find it. It's already there. Update and okay. Finally, submit. Okay. Now we have the contract. What we need to do, right-click in standard, export the contract, and let's mention DNS to web SRV farm. So that tells me this is to allow DNS services to the web SRV farm. Now we select that contract that we already built here in my provider tenant, because remember, this is a provider tenant, and we want to export that to the web SRV farm, which is going to be my consumer. We'll press submit, and the name, it's incorrect, so let's fix that. DNS2 web SRV. Okay, there you go. Alrighty, so now we exported the contract. Let me go into web SRV farm, and I should see this imported contract right here. You see? Expand contracts, import it. There you go. Now we can attach this to our consumer APG, which in this case, we mentioned that we want the application servers to access DNS services from my operations farm. Okay, we'll go under the EPG contracts, right click, add a consume contract interface. Remember, it's not the consume contract, it's the consume contract interface. Click and select my imported contract. Submit, done. You want to see how that looks logically? Let's go to the web app 1 application profile. Let's take a look at this graph right here. Okay, my consumer EPG, this is why it's labeled as E, this is EPG, has the app SRV attached to a virtual domain as well as a bare metal or physical domain. And from my DNS to web SRV, I am obtaining services from this contract interface, okay? If we go into the operations farm and do the same thing, we have to attach the contract as DNS, the provider. So let's go right click, add provide a contract, and allow DNS. That's my contract, and done. Now in AD, we see that from my DNS EPG, I am allowing DNS to via this contract. So I have another tenant attached on an interface to this contract, okay? Okay, one item that we need to make sure we configure on both tenants, and in this case, both endpoint groups, is that we need to advertise the subnets between the tenants. We attached, as we mentioned, we attached the interface onto the contract, so that we attach the contract onto my consumer, which in this case is web app 1, right? So we actually attach to the app SRV's EPG. But now I have to advertise the subnet between those two different tenants, because even though that I attach the contract, until I actually advertise the address, there's not going to be any communication. So there's one more thing left for us to do. Under the EPG, you see subnets, right click, create an EPG subnet, and we're just going to assign the same address, 10.150.1.254, just like my bridge domain. And then we're going to select share between VRFs. And this will allow me to advertise or route leak between two different VRFs, my endpoint group bridge domain subnet, okay? So I just share between VRFs and we'll click submit. We got to do the same thing on the operations farm. So let's scroll down here, application EPGs, DNS, we right click subnets, create EPG, same thing. My default gateway for my DNS endpoint group is 254.24. 10.160.0.254/24, and then we select shared and we'll press submit. Okay, so now it looks perfect. Everything is configured. The only item that we're left to do in my DNS EPG is to associate myself to the ESXi host, or in this case, to my vCenter. So I'm going to do an association to my VMM domain, so I will have a port group available in vSphere. And now I got my port group. And I already took the liberty of configuring those two VMs, so I have a new DNS server configured, and the address is 10.160.0.10. Now I just need to attach the network adapter onto my port group, which is operations farm. Remember, I just did the VMM association. Now I just select the port group, and that VM, it's on the EPG, DNS in operations farm. Let's go to DNS server. And if everything works out, I should be able to ping my default gateway, which is 10.160.254T. There you go. I sure can. Okay. Moment of truth now. So let's make sure that we have the contract as they provide a contract. And then let's take a look at Web SRV Farm. Make sure that we do also have the contract attached as a contract interface from the operations farm tenant. Okay, so in app SRV, let's bring us also a command prompt. Let me make sure that I can ping my default gateway. Sure I can. Now the moment of truth. Let's see if we can reach those DNS servers. There you go. So now I am able, from my tenant Web SRV farm, I am able to reach my DNS server. So that tells me that I have end-to-end connectivity between those two tenants. Now we have operations farm offering DNS services to the Web SRV farm. And this is how we basically allow that connectivity between the two. So if you take a look here at my diagram on the application profile, so you click the application profile, you're going to see a logical topology. From there, you can see that I have that interface from my tenant operations farm, and you can see there imported from tenant operations farm, going to my app SRV CPG, which then is associated to a virtual domain. And everything is working the same way backwards. I should be able to ping my VM. There you go. So my DNS server is also able to reach the app SRV server 1. So that tells me that, yes, the contract interface is working as expected. Okay, everyone, we have reached the end of section 5. In our next section, we are discussing secure external connectivity with L3 outs. Thank you for watching.